Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Real inspiration for real innovators. If you're looking for innovation and leadership transformation, your journey starts now.
Welcome to the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Natalie Born. I would love for you to help us spread the word by leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts so that other innovators like you can find us. And of course, I want to welcome our 60 plus countries listening from around the world. Welcome to the podcast. My guest today is Amy Balog. You'll notice that name because she was with us in season 1, and she is a senior executive coach, a facilitator, a writer, a speaker, and Amy wakes up every morning with this pursuit of her passion. It's her mission. As in terms of how she shows up in the world, which I absolutely love. And it's all about peace. And she talks about how peace is the true fuel to performance. In her 15 years of coaching partnerships with global leaders, Amy and her clients discover their peace self as their grounded identity in a world that's driven by performance. Man, don't we know it? Welcome to the podcast, Amy.
Well, it's great to be back with you, Natalie, as always. And congratulations on this global podcast. I think that is just remarkable and not surprising at all. I'm glad to come back. Now, what is this, season 3, 4?
What's season 3?
Season 3. Okay, perfect. All right, so then I want to come back every other season for sure.
Here we go. Look, you can come back every season. That's my husband's agreement too. And he's like, I get to be on at least one season, right? He's like, every time, one episode at least. So
yeah, that's perfect.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about peace over performance as it's fueled in this whole kind of bigger picture of innovation. And so this is like your work. This is your body of work when we think about peace over performance. So let's catch everyone up. Mm-hmm. Maybe they haven't listened to season 1. We hope you go back and listen to that, but catch everyone up on what peace over performance is. And then let's talk about how this ties in for innovators.
Perfect. Okay, I was absolutely primed to do that. So peace over performance, which I keep as a hashtag on LinkedIn under my profile and as an official hashtag on LinkedIn, is epiphany I had years ago in my practice that, we live in this high performance driven world, everything about performance, how we lead people, how we lead the work, how we develop products. Performance is measured every which way you can possibly imagine in the world we live in today. Yeah. And it's just wildly competitive for companies and for individuals. And beyond burnout, what I was seeing in my clients is something different, is that it's very easy for us to have our whole identity tied into our performance.
Yeah.
Like the entire thing, the whole shooting match, our amazing, big, beautiful identity, the whole thing captured inside just performance. Wow. And that is one intense place to live. And I realized when I was working with my clients that we just needed to introduce a paradigm shift. And there's a longer story about this on season 1 for your listeners to go into when we first talked about it. But the gist of it is I really came to a place, and my clients went along with me to this place, that essentially we need our peace, our inner peace, and I'm going to describe that in a minute, to be the actual fuel to our performance, so that we reshape what performance really is to us. We let peace, our peace, be the commander of our performance. So most people don't think about performance and peace being in the same vicinity together, right? But peace and performance live in duet. And so to practically get your head around this for your listeners, it's really this idea that is very implementable, which is it's the idea that you have language upon which you talk to yourself about performance. And we have to think about this language, and we have to think about it in terms of identity. So just to wrap up a little bit of what's peace over performance, you have a peace self in you. We all do. And our peace self in us knows that we are always loved, always learning, and always worthy. Stop. Just stop right there. There's nothing that never changes. It's always a constant. You are always loved, always worthy, always learning. And that is the peace self. And that peace self, when we really take that in and acknowledge it, that is our fuel to our performance self. And the performance self, we already know well. That's I get up really early in the morning. I work my tail off all day. You give me something to do. You don't have to worry about it. It's going to get done. I'm highly productive. I'm not happy until the result's on the table, all those things. And no way do I indict performance in this. It's just that I learned over the years, and so have my clients that have come along this journey, that performance cannot fuel performance. So it has profound impacts. We're going to talk about 3 things that the peace self can do for innovation in a minute. But just understanding, first of all, that performance can be reshaped by an entity of understanding your identity as a peace, self-identity, secured, sound, is a complete game changer. It's a complete game changer. And I'm going to give you some practical ways that happens in this time today. But I'll stop there for a second because that was a recap of just what is peace over performance.
That's so good. And I feel like it's so clear. I wrote it down, always loved, always learning, and always worthy. And I think if you were to take and isolate that out and pull it out over here, I think it begs the question, how many people could say, they're always loved, always learning, and always worthy. And I think that's a beautiful place to start, that if you pull that piece out right before we even talk about performance, if you can't say that, you got to start there.
Right. There's a whole journey tied to just being able to acknowledge that you have a peace self, that is always true of you. But we are aching for it, right? And so we need to connect it into performance. And then for this podcast, for this time together, you and I, it's in the listeners for, Leadership Meets Innovation. It's really, we talk about innovation. And I was thinking about this. What a wild number of years we had with complete system reset and change.
Yeah.
Tragedies and some triumphs, and everybody's refooted their life. You and I were just talking about that before this whole the whole podcast started. And essentially, the way I want to define innovation for the sake of this talk today is it's really whenever you're in a new place to do something new. I mean, essentially, my thing of having to leave Atlanta and move to Ohio with the way it happened, I mean, I was completely in new territory. We are in new territory all the time, over and over again in our lives, where we have to face something we've never done before. So we're in a new place, technically maybe with some initiative. We're in a new place with a role. We're in a new place in a relationship. Or we're maybe even a new place becoming a parent. But we're in a new place and we have to start to do new things. And that is where innovation really is happening, whether we're conscious of it or not. So we need to we can marriage our peace self into being in this new place, doing a new thing. And that's what I'm going to talk about, how the peace self helps us innovate when we're in that place. Because one interesting thing about being in an innovative seat or in a place where you need to bring something new, a new idea, a new method, a new experience, is it's quite vulnerable.
Absolutely. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
It's terrifying and it's vulnerable because you're putting yourself out there, you're rapidly ideating, you're coming up with a lot of things. Kind of off the cuff, some things are going to work, some won't, but you also don't know the appetite of the people around you to put up with the number of different ideas and the prototypes and the things that will and won't work. And so, it's whether you're in product and innovating there or even in sales and know that you have to get through, 9 no's to get 1 yes, like whatever that is, when you're putting yourself out there, you're right. There's a level of vulnerability to it. There's a level of fear that comes with, just putting yourself out there, putting your product out there, putting whatever it is out there for the world.
Right. And you think about fear and putting yourself out there and think about how we separate the peace self and performance self. Think about facing fear in the performance self, which is the impact, the absolute prime impact of the performance self by itself without any piece, just the performance, high productive, go get her done self is an impactful result. Nothing wrong with that. But think about, okay, I got to get a result. But peace, the peace self's its highest output is sustained self-empowerment. It is really like, I will always stay self-empowered because I always have this touch tone of the peace self. So, yeah, let's look at this practically. Do you mind if I use a client example with names, or not names, but just sort of a illustrative example so we can give the listeners something practical? Okay.
Love that.
Client was a product manager, and she was young in her career, but going full guns. So things were going great. Given her largest initiative yet, which was to introduce a product to the company that was going to impact the way they sold. And this is when I tell you the story, you're going to think we've seen this dozens of times, where it lengthens the product. The sales cycle goes, into more of a solution complex selling mode. Mm-hmm. It's new for the company. And you know how all these things start with fanfare and excitement. It's, it's exciting for the company executives. It's sort of everybody's on radar screen and everything starts. So she gets this going. And I really think, when we think about what the peace self, and when I was working with her, I was like, let's make sure that the peace self is really the commander of what you're doing to manage your own individual and the performance of yourself and the performance of your team through this. And there was really 3 things I want your listeners to think about. I mean, we could go on for like 7 things, but let's just stop at 3. The first thing that's really powerful, because one of the things I see as a pattern of people in performance self without peace is this this lack of acknowledgement around the learning curve. Yeah. There is fear of the learning curve. In other words, hyper performance self patterns where I just have to get to the result. And I will not feel comfortable with myself or comfortable with my team until we're getting something that's showing that we're proven on this, is that you see situations where there is no acknowledgement that we are on a learning curve.
Wow.
Zero acknowledgement of the learning curve. And that's a really dangerous place to be. Remember, the peace self is always loved, learning, and worthy. So one of the things we worked on for this product manager was I wanted her to really say and talk about to herself and to her team, the learning curve. What's the learning curve? And not be afraid to talk about what we're learning, what we don't know, because allows and to be curious about the learning curve intentionally, not only just for what they're learning about how to get this product out and learning about how it's impacting the organization and impacting the customers and everything else, but learning. I also said, I want you to pay attention to the learning curve is what you're learning about yourself as a leadership, because this is innovation meets leadership. Pay attention to that. And one of the things that was very interesting, and her peace self allowed her to do this with some self-compassion, is she learned that she really was, for the very first time in her career, leading alone at times. Because even though she had all this executive backing going into this initiative and all this stuff, sometimes, how funny things, when the heat starts hitting, where are they?
Right. I want to talk a little bit about just this learning curve thing, because when I hear you say this, I think about, I have a background in product development, and I can think when I was very young in my career, even when I took on my first product development role, coming out of a different role into that role, when I hear you talk about this scenario, I hear imposter syndrome written all over it.
Yeah.
You just feel like such an imposter that to even say, I don't know, or I'm on a learning curve, just like we all are, because we're creating something new, like that feels terrifying to expose that part of yourself and say, I'm on a learning curve. We're all on a learning curve. But what's so interesting is if we will just say it out loud, it is actually really freeing to say, right, we're going in a direction we've never been before, and therefore we are going to learn as we go. We're going to document it. We're going to try not to make the same mistake twice, but we will make mistakes. We will have failures along those way. Failure should trigger learning, not failure trigger, I'm bad. I'm a bad person. I'm horrible. Right. To be doing this. And so I hear that, and I can think back to early in my career and say, Oh, yeah. I wouldn't have admitted I was on a learning curve, you know, had
Right.
told me it was okay to do it. I would have just, you know, faked it till I maked it. And
Right.
when you do that, everybody knows you're faking it.
Right. And the funny thing, about executive coaching, when, what we do as executive coaches, one of the favorite questions of all executive coaches is, what did you learn from that? It's our favorite question.
Yeah.
What did you learn from that? And so why isn't that out there all the time, right? But see, we have to give ourselves permission. And so she adopted it and gave her just that little switch of just putting it out there, actually even gave her more credibility because she wasn't having to come in, over prepared in ways that she didn't need to be, because she could say, if I didn't get everything right, it's okay, because that's interesting. I just, now I understand that. And she would also say, I want to learn more about this.
Mhm.
Okay. So that's the first thing. It's the learning curve. The second thing is it's really about risk. So the peace self, um, the performance self without peace in relationship to personal and business risk is, um, you don't trust yourself until the results are in.
Well,
And the challenge with you and I would know, especially you, Natalie, with your expertise and all this time in on innovation, is how many leaps do you have to take into the unknown? Calculated risk. So you have to be able to say, we're going to create different milestones to see that we're progressing in the right direction, because we're not looking at the same things anymore.
right.
And so we're redefining a new path. So it's going to feel, so just like it's okay to say we've got to be learning curve, we've got to openly be comfortable talking about there is risk. And this is what what this risk looks like. In the peace self, one of the things that has to happen when we talk about risk is we have to learn to tell a powerful story about what's happening.
Mm.
And before it's like, in other words, tell the story about what's happening and where this is leading. Where in the very tightly nested performance self without any peace and everything just has to look like it's all together all the time, we have to look like there is no risk in this path. You know what I'm saying? Like, we have to actually act like there's no real risk here.
Mhm.
And the thing is, there is risk, but it's tied to this powerful story that we're living out and we're looking at. It doesn't mean, and there's times we might have to make leaps and make decisions into some aspects of the unknown. Here's how we're managing this. This is a super vulnerable place to be. But when I've noticed my clients shift into peace fueling performance, they trust that they're doing the right thing and showing up to be present to the conversations versus hoping that the right things will happen. And then they'll have more bold conversations. It's a little bit of a shift, if you follow me,
I
on
do.
risk.
Yeah, I almost feel like when you sit in that place of again, because again, let's go back to that imposter syndrome that's kind of running underneath, right? That performance self that's running underneath. You almost want to hide the level of risk that you're actually getting into, because there can be a denial that comes forward on that, because if I don't want to mess up. I don't want to let anyone down. I don't want to expose kind of the squiggly things under the rock. And the further in, and many people know this, the further into innovation you go, especially when you're building something, sometimes it gets worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
And it gets more messy before it gets clear. And so when you're in that messy middle, sometimes there's a desire to hide the risk. There's a desire to not expose the risk, versus us just, as we say, pull the elephant out in the middle of the floor and paint it red and say, look, as we're getting into this, here are some things we're discovering that we just didn't know until we were in the middle of this mess. And so that is, to me, part of the journey. And oftentimes that's the place where I think when the performance self rises up, we want to
Mhm,
hide that. We don't want to expose the risk for what it is so that we can deal
mhm.
with it and get to the other side of it.
I love what you just said there. It's also completely accurate and so, so thoughtful because that imposter syndrome that you're bringing up, the performance self without any fuel of peace is the forest fire for the imposter syndrome.
Wow.
Because in this situation, I'm with this product manager. One of the pushbacks and things that was happening, I said, go to your place. You know how I am with visual things. And I said, get, a big giant post-it pad note and put it in your office at home and list out all personal risks that you feel being involved in this project and list out all the business risks. And of course, they were thinking, we're going to lose half our sales force.
Mhm.
And they were freaked out about, this is a thing. And she was really just saying, so being anticipatory about it. So she said, you know what, a risk that is possible, the risk that we're going to be managing. And she started using language, risk we're managing and risk that we may not even see yet, or risk that will be harder to manage versus easier to manage. So she started just bringing that open with the learning curve. As again, you can see how it starts to diffuse the situation.
Yeah.
And it's the peace self because we're always learning, always worthy, always love. This is powerful. And love is powerful. Like I'm secure. Like nothing touches me.
Mhm.
And it's not ego based, it's love based. So the last one I will give you, and I just think this is key, is it's about feedback loops. So
Mhm.
feedback loops, again, in the performance self, absent of peace, maybe as you talk about, getting trapped into imposter syndrome thinking, kind of abhors feedback. It goes hand in hand with all the other things we've talked about. It's like, I'm going to pretend I know everything. I'm
Yeah.
not going to talk about the risk and I'm not going to ask for feedback. Like in other words, when the results will speak for themselves. Oh my, that's ridiculous. Oh, so in other words, so one of the things we talked about is the most powerful thing that peace self can help you do is create feedback loops. And feedback loops, like, okay, a feedback loop is where you're like, "Well, something's going on and I don't know what it is, and there's no direct conversation about it. And I have to figure out what's happening here." And so what happened, of course, is they got a PMO involved in this project and they had all these meetings scheduled up and, beautifully, put on the calendar and all these, people gathering from everywhere. And half the people knew what was going on. Half the people didn't. Anyway, long story short, I said, we were working with the client, I said, recognize where you need to proactively drop in feedback loops. And she's like, well, what do you mean? I said, well, when there's things start happening that aren't adding up to you and you want to get behind them, you need a feedback loop. So let me give you an example of what happened. So she has this meeting that the PMO is running for this endeavor. And the body language, and of course, we're doing most of this over Zoom or Teams or whatever. And anyway, but the normal people she thought would be participating and engaged were not. And there were some funky things going on in this meeting, and it kept going. And they kept going through the same formatted meeting over and over again. And every time they come into it, it was a a worse and worse experience.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, so we were talking about this. And so what she was able to say is, listen, let's drop a feedback loop
Mhm.
into what's going on with this meeting and figure out. So I want to create a feedback. So she immediately just started sending things out and asking people to start giving her feedback on this thing. And it just turned out that it really was the wrong meeting structure for what they were really trying to do. And it was the wrong people in the meeting.
Wow.
And it was just that she was, so in a sense, it was a courageous thing because the PMO person, of course, this is their job, what they're paid to do. And it was an indictment. It felt like an indictment. It's like, no, this is just the way it always is. It's painful. We just need to keep slogging through. This is the way it's supposed to be done. And it's like, no, I'm not indicting the PMO process. I'm just saying we actually have to innovate a little bit.
Mhm.
We have to respect what we're getting back in the feedback loop. And again, language that she used intentionally, feedback loop, so that it can be fluid and people can be coming together. But essentially, if you net out what happened, if, she had plowed through these things in her performance self, she might have avoided these nuances that turned out to be powerful shifts.
Yeah.
In how something had to be innovated in the business.
This is so good. I think what you're leaning into with this last piece is how frequently we do feel this sense of frustration, this sense of a lack of understanding of what's happening in the situation. And so often we do kind of just, again, in our performance self, power through versus stepping back and saying, hey, something's a little off. Let me get some more feedback. Let me understand a little bit more. That's so powerful. Amy, I can't believe it, but we're almost at the end of our time. Our time goes so fast.
I know. We barely squeeze it in.
So I want you to just with your, just a few minutes, just give some final thoughts on bringing all this together.
Well, I think when you are in your peace self, the most powerful thing that happens is you're able to stay awake to the harder realities, some that are being evidently shown to you and some that are not. And you think about the hardest realities in any situation is that we have to be vulnerable to learn, that we have to be vulnerable to take some risks, that we have to be vulnerable enough to be curious to see if something's not showing up. We can ask, we can lean into these things. And I think that's the most important thing. I think if we are looking for exterior validation through our performance self, we will be inhibited to be able to sort of be in those moments where we have to lead alone.
Oof. That's so good. You're going to have to come back. I mean, there's no way. I mean, we barely scratched the surface here, so I feel like you have to come back. People will find you. Where can they follow you?
Well, I really like right now, my most favorite place for people to come and check out everything is really with my profile on LinkedIn with Amy Balog, Balog, and just also check that out because I guest on a lot of amazing podcasts like yours, unbelievably great show you have. And I post on Peace Over Performance a lot up there on the hashtag. And that's probably the richest place at the moment right now for people to go and check it out.
I love that. Well, now you guys know why Amy is my executive coach. I love coaching with her. I love even when we just have a conversation, she always leaves me better than she found me. I just thank you so much for your time today, Amy. This has been so much fun.
I loved it, Natalie. It's good to be with you.
Well, to our listeners, thank you for joining the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. And remember, don't just get out of the box, break the box and set it on fire. Let's go transform something.
Thank you for joining us for the Innovation Meets Leadership podcast. Be sure to subscribe to our show on iTunes. Follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Innovation Meets Leadership. And visit our site at innovationmeetsleadership.com for more innovation resources.